Okay, everybody. Before we're going to begin today, we just wanted to take a moment because a lot of our colleagues today have been remembering our dear colleague and our friend Tim Allen, whose funeral was today in Golders Green. And I don't know how many of you know Tim Allen, but he was the director of the Africa Institute at the LSE, and he was somebody who really kind of tirelessly worked to get scholarships and support for African students, to create a nice environment for African students at the LSE. And he was also somebody who kind of provided an intellectual home for a lot of anthropologists and sort of more qualitative researchers working on Africa at the LSE. So at his funeral, there were so many of his former PhD students and other postdocs and researchers. And we just wanted to provide an opportunity for people who couldn't come to the funeral to take a moment to remember him. So if it's okay for you, we're going to hold a 1-minute silence for him. And I should also say on April 28th, we are also scheduling an event, a panel event, to kind of discuss his work, which will be in the Shaw Library, and I think there'll be some more information soon. So please, let's just take 1 minute. And if you remembered him, it would be nice to share your memories. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the series. I think you all know that I'm Laura Mann. I'm an associate professor in the department, and I'm the co-convener of this series. Before we begin, I have to ask you to kindly silence your phones and say if there is an emergency, we have to go to the Lincoln's Inn field and we'll help you assemble there. Today's event is going to be recorded, and it will hopefully be made available as a podcast and as a YouTube video. And with all of that out of the way, I'm now going to introduce, today we're talking about trade and we're talking about the environment. We've kind of all been aware in various different courses at the LSE, this kind of shift in the global trade environment from one of a kind of liberal order towards one that is increasingly aggressive, increasingly kind of unilateral, and we see this particularly in the environment arena, where we see kind of unilateral responses to the climate emergency, creating trade barriers and difficulties for developing countries getting access for their products. And today we have a kind of perfect speaker to help us address these kinds of issues. Silke Trommer from the University of Manchester. She is an expert in global trade. She has 2 books, The Transformations in Trade Politics, Participatory Trade Politics in West Africa, and she has a new book coming out right now called A Feminist Political Economy of Trade, Beyond Free Trade Feminism. And I think she's going to also be bringing in kind of aspects of feminism into her talk today as well. We're very, very blessed to have a great discussant. We have our own Kathy Hochstetler, who many of you may know, teaches our development and environment course at the LSE. She is an expert on the politics of environmental politics, particularly in Brazil and South America, but also extending her analysis to Brazil and South Africa with her most recent book, Political Economies of Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil and South Africa. So we're really, really excited that you could all join us tonight for this great talk. We're going to let Silke talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to welcome Kathy back on stage to give some comments, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So please do take notes of your questions so that when we open it up, we can have your questions ready for us. Okay, without further ado, please let's welcome our speaker to this podium. Thank you.
My clicker. Yes. Great. Thank you so much for the really kind introduction and the invitation as well. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to do one of these things. I'm going to talk about what happened when I took the train to London this morning, because I happened to read about the announcement that was made yesterday by the Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper about the specific areas in which the £6 billion cuts to overseas development aid between basically last year and 2027 are going to hit. And I was kind of looking at the discussion around these decisions. I was seeing that Yvette Cooper announced that the areas where the UK is going to continue to provide ODA are specifically to support fragile states, violence against women, and the response to climate change. But then I saw in some of the reactions from the development community in and around the UK that people were deploring that there is actually a real problem here, because the UK is going to stop climate aid on nature and forests. And what does it mean to support the climate response, but not to be supporting climate aid around natures and forests? So really, at the end of the day, in a way, my whole entire talk is going to be about that. I can kind of stop it here: women, nature, forest, climate. But alas, I will not. I'm going to give the lecture as intended, but maybe in the Q&A that we can have, there'll be a possibility to come back to this decision that has been made in the UK government and to kind of draw it into our conversations around trade, environment, and development as well. Okay, so I'm not used to clicking, I'm used to skipping, so that's what I'm going to skip here. Right, so when I thought about the lecture, I thought I organized it as a kind of Robert Coxian, if you all remember the famous 1981 article by Robert Cox, where he tells us we must ask 3 questions in critical theory: where are we, how did we get here, and where ought we go? So I wanted to talk about trade, environment, development, in kind of responding to these 3 kinds of questions. So basically, in the lecture that I'm going to give, I'm going to make 3 big arguments on the where are we in trade, environment, development today. I'm going to argue that we're at a time where trade policymakers and elites from around the world, global north, south, states, corporate, civil society, they're all promoting and driving a new governance norm of green trade. And they believe that green trade holds new answers for using trade as a mechanism to achieve both environmental protection and development goals. I'm going to argue that green trade is a symptom and a channel of a process of climatization of global politics. So here I build on the works of scholars like Stefan Eickhut, Lucille Mertens, who've told us that we're actually witnessing a climatization of global politics increasingly, which they define as a, quote, social process in which climate change is increasingly becoming the frame of reference for the mediation and hierarchization of other global issues. So my first argument in terms of where are we, it's to say, with the rise of the green trade norm in trade, environment, development, governance, we are in a moment of climatization, and we know this is the case because green trade treats climate change as the main problem that we need to solve when we think about the triad of trade, environment, development. So that's my first argument. My second argument is that in this process of climatization of trade politics, we're actually witnessing a reformulation of liberal environmentalism. Liberal environmentalism was coined by Stephen Bernstein in his work that influentially identified how in the 1990s and 2000s there was a policy norm emerging that in global governance that tells us that trade expansion and free market economics are a precondition for achieving environmental protection. If we want to protect the environment, we need trade and we need markets. And this has been very widely critiqued from ecological, developmental, feminist, and other perspectives. What I'm going to argue is that this new green trade governance norm that I'm telling you about, it builds on liberal environmentalism, and at the same time, it actively recognizes some of those long-standing critiques, right? So there is a real shift compared to even 10 years ago, how we were talking about trade, environment, development. We need markets, we need free trade, but there is recognition now that they come with inherent problems. In particular, people now speak about concerns around high consumption lifestyles as kind of, there's a problem around those, particularly if those are carbon-based. They also talk about toxic colonialism, and I'm going to speak in my in my lecture about what that is, and problems of intersectional inequality. And then in terms of, well, where ought we go now from this moment in green trade and this with a view to the broader debate on trade, environment, and development, I'm not going to tell you where we ought to go. This is what I hope we can discuss in the Q&A. But I hope you can bring up other things, of course. However, I will share a few concerns that I have with green trade as the new norm for addressing trade, environment, and development globally. One concern is that in the process of climatization of trade politics, wider environmental concerns such as pollution, environmental degradation, deforestation, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, and more are actively pushed to the margins or are even just completely eclipsed from the governance of trade, environment, development. It is something that people are talking less and less about. They don't think, like Yvette Cooper, it's not about forests, it's about climate, and climate means carbon. And that's a real limitation where I think that green trade governance, maybe it can help us move towards decarbonization, but I would be skeptical in terms of what it can achieve in tackling environmental destruction as a whole. And then a second concern that I have, and that I'm going to try and convince you is happening, is that green trade as a governance norm is actually normalizing and promoting paradoxical ideas that in order to tackle problems of market-based solutions to trade, environment, development, we need more market-based solutions to trade, environment, development. So I'm going to make a tentative argument. This is just coming out in my own work now, so I'll float it, and this lecture is part of me trying to see how it goes, is that green trade governance, it takes us a step further from what Sean Sullivan in 2013 called saving nature to trade it. And I'm going to argue that green trade governance, the logics and the outlook of it now, it's not about saving nature to trade it, it's actually about saving trade in the ongoing process of environmental breakdown. So that's roughly where I'm going to take you in the next 40 minutes, I think you were saying, Laura. Okay, but to start us off, I want to go to Geneva. Okay. So the WTO Public Forum, which is, I'm going to show you a video of, it's an event that takes place in Geneva every year in September, and it's part of the WTO's reaction to a democratic deficiency debate that took place in the early 2000s, where a lot of people were saying the WTO is anti-democratic, it has lots of negative effects on society, and why do these non-elected international civil servants in Geneva get to make all these decisions anyway? So among a range of different responses, the WTO started putting on a forum where every year 5,000 people or so, is this right, James? 5,000? He writes on this, so that's why I'm pointing at him. 5,000 or so people attend the WTO. It's government officials, it's civil society representatives, it's business leaders, it's students, and they all have conversations about what's happening in the world of trade. Now, James Scott, sitting over here, with colleagues, have worked on the WTO Public Forum and the trajectory it's had over the past, what would you say, 10 years or so, and have already, or from the beginning, 20, anyway, have told us through their work that at the beginning, the WTO Public Forum actually had a really wide range of opinions on these different topics that are contentious in trade, environment, labor, human rights, what have you. But over the years, the conversation has narrowed, and it's more of a meeting of like-minded policy elites and policy makers. Isn't that what you said, James? Yes, it is. Okay, so just as an introduction, the Public Forum 2023, don't worry, I'll get it on the next one.
I'm sorry.
No, don't worry about it. So the WTO Public Forum 2023 was on the topic of it's time for action. Here, it's time for action. This is what I wanted to show you. See, there we go. So 2023, the theme of the public forum was it's time for action. And the kind of general idea was that people should come and talk about the link between trade and sustainability and what should be done. So with my colleagues, Matt Patterson, Sandra Barragan-Contreras, James Jackson, and Pritish Bahuria, we felt that it was a great empirical site to try and understand where policy elites and global policy communities were at when it comes to this question of tackling trade, environment, development. So what we looked at the program of the forum, and we downloaded lots of audios and videos, transcribed it all, and analyzed basically what it was that these people were talking about and what they were saying in terms of green trade. But just to get a bit of a flavor and an introduction, I'm going to play you about a minute and a half of this video that the WTO produced, where it kind of shows what the Public Forum 2023 was all about. So let's see. Okay, here we go.
I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to the WTO Public Forum and to this third event in our presidential lecture series.
Wow, you got all of these critical words inside the same panel.
It's really helped develop tools and resources for historically marginalized groups across the globe.
I understand that today is the first time that we've had Indigenous peoples represented in a high-level panel like this.
This young social entrepreneur trying to make climate action in his own way happen.
We have to look at ways in which developing countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines can benefit from this type of technology.
Right.
It's not whether we should have trade or not trade. I think it's what kind of trade do we want.
How we can balance the table between the dialogues on trade and the dialogues on climate change.
The World Trade Organization has done a huge amount to stop protectionism, but it's telling us to wake up.
I cannot think of any person other than Gordon to share his thoughts on how we in the world can work together to make trade work better for people everywhere and for the planet.
I'm going to...
Okay, so this was the WTO official sort of take on what the forum was about in 2023. I'm going to make my situation worse, because I also want to play you an extract from a particular panel discussion that took place where a woman spoke who is, her name is Carrie Stoddart-Smith, and she is founder and director of a consultancy firm for Maori, or representing Maori and Indigenous peoples in New Zealand. And she had quite a different take on what green trade was and what it was for. Now, it's only another minute or two I want to play you, but because the audio isn't perfect, I transcribed it. Thank you very much. Okay, so this is this Indigenous representative from New Zealand who says, the second thing that is kind of the main thing I wanted to cover, she talks about this focus, it isn't new, and New Zealand supports it as well, but it's the liberalization of environmental goods and services. She goes on to say, while I can appreciate that WTO members are promoting it and they see it as an opportunity to enhance, as they call it, the three wins, enhance trade, the environment, development, there's actually some real issues in here for Indigenous peoples. And she talks about significant concerns that Indigenous people have, and it's kind of expressed in a quote someone brought earlier during the forum where they said, Indigenous people are always asked to take it on the chin for no benefit in return. So Carrie Stoddart-Smith then says, there is no consideration and there's no time being taken in these environmental goods and services negotiations to address any kinds of longer term impacts of what liberalization means. And she gives as examples concerns around how trade liberalization and broader market liberal policies have affected the ecosystems in which Indigenous people live, their capacity to live in harmony with nature, and that all of this is exacerbated by practices like surges in industrial agriculture, which lead to soil degradation, sea contamination, deforestation. She says these are all the long-term impacts of trade liberalization and economic legalization, but they're not being talked about when we talk about the benefits of green trade for environment and development and sustainability. So basically, it's these kinds of two contributions that really reflect extremely well what we found to be kind of at the heart of the controversies in the green trade governance norm when we were analysing it by looking at the debates that were being held at the forum. So basically, the argument that we're going to be making in this paper that we're working on at the moment is, first of all, that green trade reflects a shift to a process of climatization of trade politics. It was pretty clear already in the WTO video. What we're interested in here is renewable energy technologies. We're interested in the links between trade and climate, and some of these older or like more long-standing concerns that the indigenous representative raises around pollution, deforestation, erosion of soil, soil depletion, etc., they are mentioned, but it has become marginal. It's not anymore at the center of the debate of trade, environment, development. That debate is now about climate. And so we then make this argument based on this kind of literature on climatization of global politics that comes from scholars like Stefan Eickhut, Lucille, and Martens and colleagues as well. And so what they tell us is that climatization of global politics, it is a process whereby climate change becomes the central reference against which other problems of global governance are ordered, but they also tell us that this process involves three interrelated levels of practice. They say it's based on diplomatic activity among states and international organizations, networked state, non-state relations, and also broad discourses and norms that are animating global politics. And they suggest that in this process of climatization, where climate change in lots and lots and lots of different governance and policy areas just starts becoming central and starts organizing how policymakers think, we can point to what they call climate logics in the making. So these climate logics are basically the kind of taken for granted understandings of how this policy area now needs to work, given that climate change is becoming one of its central problems. So what we did with the public forum was, first of all, the nice thing is, as you noticed when we were all clicking, the entire program is publicly available. It's all there. You go on the WTO website, you can see everything. You can click into any session, listen to the audio if you manage, or a video recording at times. So we went to the 2023 Public Forum website, and the first thing we looked at was, okay, how prevalent are different kinds of framing this problem in the program overall? So we looked at session titles. There were 134 sessions, and about half of them were explicitly concerned with problems of environment, trade, development. Of those, more than half, you can't really see this very well either because the colors aren't great, but more than half of those panels that were concerned with environmental and sustainability problems were using the word green to express that concern. Sustainability was the next most common framing, and environment was actually really rare. So we're kind of seeing here a shift away from talking about trade and environment towards sustainability, yes, but also quite significantly this discursive rise in what it is that we're talking about is we're talking about green trade. And then what we did is we basically pulled up all the green trade panels, we transcribed them, or we had them machine transcribed to be fair, and we started looking at, well, what it actually is that the people who are debating on these panels are talking about. So the word cloud here is basically just an in vivo word cloud where we're saying, hey, in vivo, tell us what are the most frequently used words. And it shows very clearly this thing that we think is clear, that this is climatization. So the most frequently used word was trade, 128 mentions, and then climate, 87. And then around that, we have a big kind of talking point around carbon, energy. Yes, development is there, developing, themes like that, sustainable. But really, it is not a conversation around deforestation. It is not a conversation around soil. It is not a conversation around the oceans. These are not the words that are being used on these panels. People are talking about climate, and they're talking about carbon overwhelmingly. We then kind of drove little down into the actual conversations. We broke it down in different ways. So we came up with different lexical markers for climate versus broader ecological concerns. And we looked at the green trade panels just kind of to see, again, how often does this stuff come up. And so essentially one of the interesting things I think that we see here is you see here animal. Nobody mentioned any kind of an animal at all, right? In a trade and environment conversation. If you went back even 20 years, you would hear people talk about shrimp and dolphins and sea turtles all the time. Animal conservation and the impacts on trade rules of specific species was once a big topic of trade and environment debate. But now in green trade, animals are gone. I found, because I like words, I find it interesting. I found it interesting to see that people use plant almost as often to refer to an industrial plant, like a manufacturing plant or something like that, as they use it to refer to a tree or a natural plant. And overall, nature was like the most commonly used lexical marker that we related to ecology, but it was it would have come on this big chart, it would come in lower than decarbonization in terms of frequency of use. So really the debates were overwhelmingly about these kinds of 4 or 5 topics here, which are climate, carbon, energy, emissions, transition, renewable, and decarbonization. So this is kind of the first point that I promised I would try and convince you of, that this move to green trade as the new governance norm, or as an emerging and increasingly dominant governance norm of trade and environment development, it is about climatization of trade politics. It's making the problem about the relationship between trade and climate. And actually, another thing that I find interesting, and why it's interesting to look at the public forum, we then looked at who are the people that are talking on these panels, who is saying these things, right? And what you see here is we're breaking down the panelists by regional affiliation. So you see that actually a bulk part are people, probably international civil servants, working for international organizations or big international NGOs, things like that. But then you actually have a global north-south balance. Actually, even a few more global south representatives than global north. And then similarly also on the kind of non-state side, or like basically by affiliation, by interest, panelists by interests, you have an overwhelming half of the participants are public interest, so they're either working for international organizations, states, or universities. But then on the private side, it splits half and half in profit and not-for-profit. So there are corporates, but they're actually outnumbered by not-for-profit organizations. And when we break them down, there was a big contingent of indigenous groups. That was kind of how it was at the forum that year. And then a big number of development organizations. Actually, the environmentalists, they're here. There weren't that many. And then we had some women's representatives, no labor, and no consumers. So this is maybe a picture we can reflect on later, but just to say this green trade trend and this trend to say, okay, trade and environment development is now about climate, it is about carbon, we're quite confident to say it is a global norm. It is not something that is kind of limited to a particular type of actor or something that's being imposed from one side of the globe to another. It's a global phenomenon. Okay. So that brings us to the question then, how did we get here? How did we get to this point where climatization of trade politics is happening? So in order to talk about this, I'm going to argue that the climatization of trade politics that we see under green trade governance norms is actually built on liberal environmentalism, and at the same time it presents a reformulation of the long-standing debates around liberal environmentalism. So in order to kind of contextualize and historicize this for you, I'm going to go back quite a bit in time. Because really, to understand what liberal environmentalism is and where it came from, I'm going to say we need to start with the year 1972. So in 1972, you may already know about this, But we had the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment taking place in Stockholm, where very famously Indira Gandhi, is the Prime Minister of India at the time, is remembered for saying, poverty is the worst source of pollution. And apparently it's one of those, maybe people in the room know this, I was reading up on it and she never said that. It's one of those that are attributed to someone that they never actually said. But it doesn't really matter. The moment stands in time. We remember the conference for Indira Gandhi saying this, and we remember the conference for pointing out that the basic development model promoted in the 1970s and the quest for environmental protection were standing in conflict. They couldn't be brought together. There was a contradiction between them. Arguably, a similar point was made in 1972 in the publication of the Limits of Growth report by the Club of Rome, which wasn't so much concerned about development as such, but it basically gave us this idea to say infinite growth is impossible on a finite planet. We won't be able to kind of grow the economy forever unless we change something in the underlying economic model of how we do that. Now, at the same time, in 1973, we saw the launch of the Tokyo Round under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the Tokyo Round is also significant for this kind of concern about trade, environment, development questions, because the Tokyo Round gave us the so-called enabling clause, which still stands in the WTO and which provides exceptions from standard liberalization commitments for developing countries. And the enabling clause, in many ways, was kind of a response to a campaign that developing countries had been having in the GATT for quite some time at this point, to say that this whole global trade regime really isn't reflecting or respecting or helping us to enhance any of our interests. So in the 1970s, we see a debate, but it's actually a fractured debate. It's a debate around how development and environment aren't commensurable, and economic growth and environment aren't commensurable, and also how the trade regime isn't really fit for solving problems of global development. So on the back, really, of the various conversations that began in Stockholm and also around the Limits of Growth report, we come into the 1980s. And in 1983, the United Nations sets up the World Commission on Environment and Development. It's also famously known as the Brundtland Commission, named after its president, Gro Brundtland, from Norway. And basically, to put it simply, the Commission on Environment and Development, it works for 4 years, and in 1987 it produces this report called Our Common Future. And Our Common Future suggests that there is a way of linking economic growth with environmental protection. It says there isn't a conflict, it can't be done. It can be done. And very famously, Our Common Future gives us not only the terminology of sustainability and sustainable development, but it also gives us the definition. And it says that sustainable development means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. As you all know, this is a widely successful concept. It gets picked up all around global governance in various arenas over time. One of the places where sustainability gets picked up as a guiding idea and a concept and a political goal is the WTO. So the WTO launches, or rather, I should say the GATT launches its last multilateral round of trade negotiations in 1986, which is the Uruguay round. And the Uruguay round goes on, is completed in 1994 with the Marrakesh agreements, which lead to the creation of the World Trade Organization, where in the preamble, and I know you can't read this, but it's in the first paragraph of the preamble, WTO members make a commitment to sustainable development. And they say one of the key goals, one of the reasons why we come together and foster trade and economic cooperation in the WTO is because we want to seek to protect and preserve the environment and enhance the means of doing so of various various countries that are members of this organization. So we start coming into this moment where we get this idea from saying trade, environment, development can never come together. We come to the 80s and early 90s, and we're getting kind of governance agendas and ambitions and goals that are formulated that say, yes, we can. Only then the WTO agreements start being implemented, and a lot of people around the world, it is safe to say, don't agree. So the iconic model, or iconic kind of moment that I want to refer to symbolize this is the 1999 Battle of Seattle around the WTO. Raise your hands if you've heard of the Battle of Seattle. This is really very good, because in a lot of lectures, people do not remember it. But basically, in a nutshell, in 1999, the WTO held a ministerial conference in the city of Seattle, and in the negotiating room, there was a desire, particularly among the EU, but also a couple of other members, to launch a new round of negotiations. Something that developing countries really didn't want at the time, mainly because they were still implementing the results from the Uruguay round and didn't find them particularly developmentally friendly. So there was a clash in the room, but at the same time, there were many clashes in the streets of Seattle as thousands and thousands and thousands of protesters came together, and this was also a really broad alliance. So some of those were developmentalists, some of those were students, some of those were feminists, but the environmentalists also brought a big contingent of protesters to the streets of Seattle in 1999. These protests didn't end very well. They ended in clashes and street battles with armed police. And actually, I learned, interestingly, the WTO Battle of Seattle is also seen as a key moment in the changes in policing in certainly Western democracies. But that is a side note for a different course. Or maybe the discussion, I don't know. The point that I'm trying to make is when you look at the images of the protesters that are saying the WTO is not working for environment, what are they talking about? They're talking about a whole host of different things. I was telling you about the turtles. This was on the back of a very famous WTO case, the shrimp turtle case, that was basically read by the environmental policy community as the WTO preventing governments from taking measures to protect endangered species. But we have concerns about deforestation, we have concerns about all of life. So we have these kind of broad views where people were saying, you're telling us you want to do sustainable development, but the WTO is not equipped to do so. So these kinds of critiques led to, as Martin Weber and other scholars have told us in their writings, they led to an increasing recognition of environmental concerns in WTO and trade law more generally, which brought into being an interlinked global governance agenda between environmental governance and trade cooperation. And this is what Stephen Bernstein and others refer to as liberal environmentalism, right? And liberal environmentalism has basically a fundamental idea, which is to say, look, what we should be doing, what states should be doing to resolve these potential clashes between trade, environment, development, is not imposing protections to limit trade flows. Instead, what they should be doing is the state should facilitate forms of trade that generate growth, but at the same time work to substitute polluting economic activities with less polluting types. This is sort of the fundamental idea, that we need this economic growth, and then as we generate it, we also need to find cleaner forms of economy, of industry, and this is how we can square the circle of this problem. Now, liberal environmentalism then led to a huge debate. As much as it was very successful in policy terms, it was also quite loudly at times resisted, whether by various civil society organizations, academics, and so on and so forth. So, just in a nutshell, to kind of paint the picture in broad strokes, to move then on in the conversation. Liberal environmentalism basically has a number of key assumptions that it works with. One is that growth and free trade are preconditions for environmental protection. But it also puts big emphasis on the use of resources and technologies as effective tools to support environmental protection. Within the various technologies, it is particularly interested in information and transportation technology. It also, liberal environmentalism also supports the increasing reliance on services trade, investment, and regulatory harmonization as something that can help states have a greener, cleaner economy while trading more. And as a kind of governance norm and a governance practice, liberal environmentalism puts a lot of trust in trade experts, so economists, lawyers trained in the arenas, in the wisdoms of trade, to actually assure that we can make this very delicate balance become a reality. So at the same time as this was promoted, as I was saying, there were a lot of critiques of liberal environmentalism basically from day one. Ken Konka is one of those scholars who has argued, and this is a quote from an article in the year 2000, the hyperliberalization of trade is inimical to the quest for global ecological sustainability. So the arguments against liberal environmentalism broadly focus on three areas of skepticism. So the first one is about how trade governance basically subordinates environmental interests and broader public policy interests to economic interests. And this kind of critique then is iterated by scholars like Martin Weber, who say that introducing environmental agendas into liberal trade governance subjects environmental concerns to the institutional logics of these organizations. And they, in the way that in their value system and the laws and the governance logics work, it just favors, and he says, strictly economic interests over the concerns of a global public. The second line of critique is that actually a lot of environmentalists took issue with the argument that you can just clean up your production and continually expand trade, thereby limiting negative environmental impacts. They actually argued that the opposite is the case. So the overall expansion and production and consumption that trade enables overwhelms the efficiency gains in favor of clean production or transportation and consumption. And overall, they make the argument, if we want greener trade, we need basically less consumption-heavy societies, and that means invariably less trade in whatever way, shape, or form. The third line of critique was connected to concerns for questions of social and ecological justice. And this is kind of where this concept of toxic colonialism comes into play. So scholars like Herman Gonzalez in the early 2000s wrote about the ways in which the global north's resource-intensive, consumption-oriented lifestyles basically led to the waste and the economic pollution that resulted from that being exported to developing countries. And then this is kind of this comment, if you remember, that the indigenous person at the WTO made that I was reading out, indigenous communities always take it on the chin. So the idea is, if you're not in the global north, if you're not at the core of the global economy, this is where you may get clean production, but then actually the continuing environmental outfall from this is going to be suffered on the margins of the global economy, very often in developing countries. And this scholarship also points out that the ways in which the social and environmental costs of this kind of toxic colonial model are distributed really very often also play out along intersectional lines of race, class, and gender. So, what did we do? This is like the big story of liberal environmentalism. So what did we do with it in relation to the WTO Public Forum 2023? Well, we started coding, right? So we wanted to know, okay, so this is the old debate, liberal environmentalism, here's how we got there, here's the critique. Green trade, this climatization, is it a rupture? Are there continuities? If so, which ones? So we started coding the data for whether statements that people were making in these public forum debates were expressing liberal environmental ideas, or whether they were expressing some of the traditional critiques associated with liberal environmentalism. And so what we found, and I kind of didn't expect it, but as you see here, when we coded all those panels, it kind of holds a balance. We get a lot of statements that echo basic principles of liberal environmentalism, in particular around a deep trust that we do need trade, and there are a lot of statements that say we need trade to decarbonize, we have to have trade to go green, we can't do without it. Also, new free trade agendas, by which I mean an emphasis on services, investment, digital economy, regulatory harmonization. So we see a lot of that. Transport is a big, big topic. Decarbonization of transport is something people talk a lot about. But at the same time, we get basically just as many people that mention these problems of toxic colonialism, that talk about the fact that high consumption lifestyles, it can't stay what it is if we're going to try and resolve the climate crisis. And they also talk a lot about intersectional inequality. So basically, what we then did from there is we kind of drilled in more deeply and started pulling out different quotes to try and understand what are then the trade and climate logics in the making of this new green trade governance norm, right? So I could, and Martins tell us, when you have instances of climatization of global politics, there's always a climate logic in the making. There is a way of thinking that tells you what it means to connect, in this case, trade to climate. Now, I have to look across and ask my chair, how long am I still allowed to speak?
I was kind of thinking, maybe, how much time do you want? 10 minutes?
That's not a good question to ask, because I just talk and talk and talk.
10 minutes?
Will I do 10 minutes? That's a good idea. Okay, great. So, basically, I'm just gonna, I guess what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you kind of an overview inside. Where did we get from here? I won't pull up too many of the individual quotes that I brought, but maybe in the Q&A I'll pull them up to illustrate certain things. So one of the first things that I find striking when we're looking at kind of what we're finding in these discourses is that this old critique of techno-optimism, it is gone. Nobody critiques techno-optimism. It doesn't matter how outspoken some people were in terms of saying this toxic colonialism is really still a problem, or even saying there is still a problem in terms of thinking that we'll solve this climate issue through trade. Regardless of that, everybody, and very few people taking that kind of side, everybody felt there was consensus that whatever way we're going to solve it, technology is part of the answer. And there was a real, actually I do want to jump to one slide talking about this, there was a real greenwashing, actually, if you want to say that, around what then the various policy solutions that were being envisaged actually meant in terms of environmental impact. So as I was saying to you, and I'm jumping now because of the 10-minute panic, new free trade was a really big thing. So people were really clear that we need trade finance, we need new technologies, we need technology transfer, we need digital trade. And in discussing this, they were very actively debating the environmental benefits of digitization. So this is an example. Someone spoke on session 58, and the person said digitization has 3 green components. One is digitization allows us to monitor the impact on nature. So what is happening in nature? Digitization allows us to monitor this. As if we didn't know, but okay, fine. It also allows us to bring new knowledges to people to implement sustainable practices, and it allows us bringing finance and financial incentives. But the problem is, I was telling, we were talking about it over lunch, I was trying to find out on the train, what are the known environmental impacts of digitization, and my Google wouldn't spit it out. But it ended up being the train, not some digital conspiracy. I managed to look it up. So basically, a standard data center, if you didn't know, has the energy needs of approximately a small city, 100,000 households, to run in a day, right? It has water needs, because it needs a lot of cooling. Those servers, they need a lot of cooling. So it's 3 to 9 million liters of water a day. And of course, these servers aren't small. If you ever look what a kind of a data center actually looks like, what I found in the quick search that I could do before coming here, it's gave me somewhere between 0.4 to 11 square kilometers. So all of this obviously has huge environmental impacts, and yes, the impacts are intersectionally felt as well, because in different parts of the world, access to water is already a problem, is expected to increase with increasing climate change, so on and so forth. But none of this is acknowledged at all in the debates at the forum, right? And the same might be said for actually much of the solutions and these market-based solutions that are being put forward by the various people speaking. And this is even the case for those people who acknowledge the limitations of liberal environmentalism. So you can't really see it here, but you're just going to hear me out now. There is a really interesting discursive move made where people say, and they say quite literally, do I find him? Yeah, this here person is the WHO ambassador of Nigeria speaking, and he gives a really long kind of explanation that is standard critique of liberal environmentalism. He says, in an effort to increase production and trade capacity, countries attempted to implement policy that incentivizes pollution. And he goes on and on. We have used up resources, we've wrecked the earth, and then he says, and really this is not in line with the sustainable development goals at all. And then he concludes, we therefore need to work collectively to address these challenges through utilization of available technology, resources, and trade. So there is this kind of moment where we are acknowledging these are the limitations, but we're saying to overcome them, we need more market-based solutions. This is also something that is kind of must, or is kind of offered as a response to these intersectional inequality considerations. So speakers talk about how, yes, women are often carrying some of the heaviest costs of environmental depletion, particularly in the global south. But then at the same time, a lot of speakers talk about how women really are going to also save us. And indigenous women and women in the global south in particular. Why? Because, and this is a speaker on session 42, indigenous women have an intimate connection with the land. And they are more likely to produce using sustainable sourcing methods, energy efficient, etc., etc. So the person says, indigenous peoples and women in developing countries and small-scale producers in developing countries, they have a really low carbon footprint. So if we only give them climate finance, trade finance, entrepreneurship training, digital commerce, they will help us promote a carbon neutral economy. And it's just a really paradoxical idea. I'm gonna kind of let us debate that. I'm gonna say more about that maybe later on. I just wanna end kind of the lecture with this one quote that for me really kind of summarizes a lot all that is really strange in this green trade governance norm that is emerging. There was a speaker on a session who as a male speaker who talked about growing up in poverty in rural Kenya, in an area that has always been prone to droughts. And he kind of spoke quite emotionally actually about how hard it was growing up there and how much harder it must be now because the droughts are increasing and the desertification is increasing and so on and so forth. And he then ends up reflecting that it has become extremely hard to be a kid in rural Kenya. So when I think about the digital economy, I think about being able to work remotely for any company in the world without leaving your village. So this, for me, is just a striking image of the green trade future that we are imagining is not now, like under liberal environmentalism, a future where growth allowed us to have a clean world. But it's actually a future where we're sitting in a desert with a computer working for a corporate entity somewhere else. And I'm just gonna leave it on that thought.
Thank you so much. And sorry about all the...
It was all part of slapstick, yes.
Okay, so we're now going to have Kathy Hochstetler give us her comments and questions, and then we'll open it up for questions. So get your questions ready.
So nice to see so many of you. I recognize a number of you from my course in global environmental governance, and I really appreciated Silke's presentation today. It was a really interesting overview of the state of debate at the WTO right now, and thinking about what's going on in current trade debates and trade relations. And of course, it is interesting as somebody who's watched the WTO for a long time, because I think there's often quite a narrow presentation of what the WTO tries to do, that it's very narrowly about trying to remove barriers to trade and liberalizing. And then you hear there's lots of talk about things like climate change, and then you discover that much of it is still about promoting trade and liberalization in various ways. And that's really, I think at one point that you had a subtitle on your talk that was kind of, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think there is something of that element to the talk here. So, so very much appreciated it, and very much appreciated thinking about how things were changing and how they stayed the same. So I have just a couple of questions. I won't spend long on the questions, since I know that we don't have all that much time left, but I had maybe some provocative questions to ask you. And the first one was just, you start out with this argument that there's a real problem. I think you frame it really. There's a problem in that other environmental issues have disappeared and we have climate left. And I think that's something that has been kind of a bigger issue for the study of environmental politics and the conduct of environmental politics. Climate has really been taking over the field in some pretty important ways. But I had a kind of provocative question to ask you about that, because there are other concepts out there. And if we were, for example, talking about nature-based solutions instead, or payments for ecosystem services, we might be talking about forests rather than talking about climate directly. But would we really be having a different conversation? Or and maybe here's a hypothesis for why we so often come to climate and to things like renewable energy in particular. I mean, there is something quite nice about climate in that the climate regime has been set up so everything is very easily measurable. Everything is in units of sort of carbon equivalent. We have renewable energy. We know what it does to carbon, that it's a low carbon production of electricity, et cetera. So there's something very measurable about climate in ways that not all environmental problems are quite so measurable and so quite so tractable. So maybe my hypothesis then is that we end up talking about climate because it's in a way easy, but that I don't know that talking about a wider set of environmental issues would necessarily give us a different debate. So that's my first maybe provocative question about the way the thing is framed. And then the forum is very interesting, and the quotes are fascinating, and if she'd been able to go through all of them, there are all sorts of very interesting things being said at this forum. And I think it's an interesting location to look at who is there and what are they saying. But I had some follow-up questions on that. And maybe James is going to answer them eventually, but one of my questions is sort of more exactly, who is there? I mean, you gave us kind of the broad framings of some are private actors and some are environmentalists, but not all environmentalists are the same. And I would certainly wonder, are the environmentalists who were once in the streets in Seattle, are they now inside the forum at the WTO, or are these actually really different environmentalists? And I'd also be interested in hearing something about the process of who is it who is actually in attendance? Are these people who were self-selected, in which case maybe they're there at the forum because at some level they're, even if they're environmentalists, part of this broader discourse already on marketization? And so they're environmentalists, but they're, you know, WWF style of environmentalists and not Greenpeace style of environmentalists, if you will. So is it self-selected? Has somebody selected them? Are the protesters of Seattle there? Just I would wonder a bit more about who exactly is there, because that would give us a better framing for understanding the things that they're saying. And then along with that too, you know, really interesting chart that you had on the different discourses, that you get a lot of the language of liberal environmentalism on the one side, and then you get the critics and how those issues came up. But I was wondering too, so if we do have quite a variety of actors and activists there, for example, are they the ones who are the critics, and then all those market actors are the ones saying the pro-trade and pro-market? Like, does it line up by the categories? So I had a bunch of questions about the forum, and maybe you can say a bit more about that. And then two maybe small points, and you can decide how far you want to go into these, because these are now things that were maybe not in the presentation, but they're things that I'm going to have to talk about to my class in 2 weeks, so thought I would ask somebody else. One of the topics that dropped out a bit here is the whole question of development. And one of the questions that I'm going to be talking to my class about is, well, does the World Trade Organization give developing countries development policy space? Are they able to make the choices that they want to? Could they choose green growth if they wanted to, whatever they think that is? But can you talk a bit more, you know, what is currently happening with development policy space, the WTO, in your view? And I'll probably have my own view, but that's okay. I'd be very interested to hear you to talk about that. And then there was the final topic that you talked about, or you raised as one of your 3 questions, and maybe you want to leave it for others to ask you more questions about it. But you said there's this interesting shift, perhaps, from a position that has us saving nature to trade it, to actually needing to save trade. And I think that's an issue that maybe resonates in a current geopolitical moment. You know, is trade the strong actor here at this point, or is trade in trouble? And how do we think about kind of that geopolitical moment? Are we saving trade in the ongoing environmental breakdown? And I know you said you didn't have that in the talk, but I think it is a really interesting question because it makes us reflect on exactly what the strength of the current trade regime is. And I was curious to know how you saw that. So you could probably talk another hour on just those questions. And I don't know what Laura does now, if she gives you time to make an initial response, or?
Yes, we can let you to respond before we open it up.
Okay.
And you can kind of be selective about where you want to.
But answer my lecture questions.
I'll just be really brief on some, and then brief rather than really brief on others. So so the saving trade in the environmental kind of breakdown, it's actually something that I'm still thinking through. It came up when we started working on this paper. I tried to understand how do different countries understand green trade. What do they think it is? And there popped up among the definition, the US in 2022 defined it in this way. It basically said green trade is about using regulation in order to protect our trade. And I was kind of reading it, I can't remember the wording, but I was reading it and I was thinking, wait a minute, they're trying to protect the trade. They're saying environment is breaking down, but we want to keep trading as it is. And I kind of threw it on the page, and we had various iterations of the paper, and we kind of took it out again. But when I was looking, we kind of finally finished coding and get the qualitative side of it, it kept coming up as something that seems to be there in the conversation. So there is one quote, for example, and this was who was talking. So this is the president of the Caribbean Development Bank, who recalls having been in the WTO his entire career, because these people move from post to post, and he may well have been a negotiator, and now he's at the bank, all that stuff. And he says, it used to be a real problem. The environmentalists would say you need to see the impact of trade on the environment, and we couldn't have a conversation with business people because they were interested in different things. And he says, now we flip the conversation. what is the impact of the environment on trade? And now we can talk. And so this is coming up, I think, maybe as a conversation we want to keep having, because I think there is something to that, but I don't have an immediate answer right now. Development and policy space. This is one for the afters. My take on this is, in the WTO, you'll always hear both discourses. You'll hear either from the members or also experts who are working on this, those of you who tell you there is loads of policy space. The law is written in that way that there's always lots of options, theoretically, to pursue any policy goal that you want. And you're gonna get lots of people who tell you that this is absolutely not the case and that the WTO has done nothing but limit development policy space ever since it's come into being. My take on this is just a really personal impression, having worked on trade issues for probably something like 20 years. This is well, it's Friday afternoon, I can say it. Both development and policy space are now a dirty word in the WTO. We've not been able to resolve the Doha development round, and I think a lot of that eventually people kind of take the lesson of the Doha development round as when we said development, we were doomed to failure with this round. We weren't going to be able to, maybe it may be too strong. James might contradict it. But, and the same is true for policy space. Why? Because we have kind of a handful of actors left, state actors, that speak out for these things in the WTO. They are South Africa and India. And like from just trade negotiators that I've spoken to, they just say they're the troublemakers. So you say policy space, you're a troublemaker. It's politically, it's a non-word. Okay, the forum. Who is there? What's happening? Etc. Etc. Yes. So there is an annex in the paper. I know nobody reads annexes, so there has to be a better way. But basically, a lot of these people are either they're WTO ambassadors, so they are career civil servants that work in trade, that work in Geneva for their countries, and they go. We have people who are high-level civil servants in development banks, financial organizations. We have all kinds of global governance institutions, FAO, ILO. They all go. Because with the forum, so the way that it works is that different people propose a panel, and then the WTO Secretariat selects what panels they want. But registration, it's open. So anyone can go. So if you are ever in Geneva in September, you just sign up on the website, and that's it. You have to show your passport, you're in. So it is a mix between curated and self-selected. And the question about the environmentalists, so no, Greenpeace isn't there. They don't go. They've stopped going, right? It's the WWF people that attend. And they sit on these panels and they kind of, I don't know, she struck me as being in an awkward position when I was kind of listening to what she was saying. But I think the bigger point to make about attendance is, yes, there probably is an element of, how would I say it? There is an element of curation on behalf of the WTO Public Forum organizers in terms of certainly who gets invited to organize a panel. There's also long been a desire to want to be seen to invite the critics, but I also see a problem, and that's why it's really important, and I'm glad that you're learning about trade environment development, because a lot of movements have turned away from the WTO. A lot of movements drew the conclusion in kind of the 2010s that the WTO is dead, so it's a waste of our time. Nothing comes out of this place anymore. The moment of the big deals is over. The moment of the tragic dispute settlement proceedings is gone. We direct our attention elsewhere, and I think it's a horrible mistake to be making. So, on that question of, you said it was going to be provocative, and I got worried, but then I was like, no, I agree with you. So I don't intend to say, if we just talk about forests, the problem would, it would go away. No, I don't intend to say that. Obviously, basically we need to change more about the conversation than just the focus of the issues that we're thinking about. But I just wanted, in a way, document with this research that this is now what's happening in the trade and environment conversation, that it used to be a lot bigger and now it isn't. And yes, why is that? Yeah, but because that's what's happening everywhere, right? But I didn't intend to kind of say that if we just talk about shrimp again, it'll be fine.
Okay.
Okay.
And more over a beer.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Do we have any brave souls who want to go first? Okay, we have one question here in the stripy shirt.
Hi, can you hear me? Good. So this is a question a little bit in line to what Kathy asked you just now, the last question you answered, which is when you showed that first graph that showed the topics that were being discussed, I perhaps wasn't very surprised because ultimately the WTO is a forum that is premised on the existence of markets and growth. That's why it exists. So naturally you're only going to discuss not just things that can be measured, but things that have a market. And if you look at the topics, that's precisely what's being discussed. And I guess my question is, do you see it as a need that environmental questions beyond climate, which is where the carbon markets are, et cetera, get discussed here? Or is there a different forum that we should be looking into to try to resolve the broader issues of biodiversity, conservation, etc., that have nothing to do with markets? They may be being affected by markets, but they're actually, they won't find a solution in markets.
Okay. Any more questions for this round? I myself have a question, but okay. Question at the back.
Hi. So my question is perhaps related to yours. It's in a similar line. People go to these meetings and they do, and we know this, a bit of forum shopping, right? So people that are interested in certain topics go to this one, and then perhaps the exact same state will go to a different forum and say something different. So I was wondering if this study is extended. I know it's impossible and things like that, but if it is extended to a UN agency, say UNCTAD, for example, where development is not seen as a dirty word, would it have the same results, or perhaps would it be different because the forum is different in itself, therefore the people that are attending there are also different and have different arguments for that specific place?
I kind of want to add something to this question. I thought that what you kind of showed us was also very helpful for master students looking for a desk-based project for their dissertations, because you're kind of analyzing a conference and the sessions. But I wonder, you know, when you were talking about development and policy space being a dirty word, how much there is a kind of chilling and a kind of socialization of the people who are even kind of critical might go into this environment and feel intimidated about what to speak. And I wonder if there's kind of a way of looking at the critics that you've picked up and maybe doing some more research that's not just looking at their statements, but looking at the kind of how they felt about going to this place, how they felt about, you know, pitching their, what they, you know, how they wanted to intervene in a way that was constructive. Because I think sometimes when we do kind of discourse analysis, we're not always sort of seeing like how the people who produced those words kind of were, you know, thinking strategically about the kinds of words to use in a forum. So that was kind of one of the things I kind of wondered about when I was listening, about this idea, is it a global norm or is it sort of people being, you know, sort of strategic about how they intervene? Right, yep.
Yeah, okay, so I'm poor old James. This is James Scott sitting here. He's my co-author on various things. And one of the things we did together with Erin Hanna as well, we edited a collection some time ago now called Expert Knowledge in Global Trade, which is precisely about that, because there are various studies by people who've looked at, I mean, in relation to this project, I agree will be really interesting to do. But there's more long-standing literature that shows that when civil society actors try and engage in trade policy and they manage to influence it, it is most of the time because they have learned to translate their policy or their political demands into a language and a logic that trade policy makers recognize as expert. Because what happens, and this is personal observation, but it's also been documented in scholarly work, what happens is policymakers say, if you go in and you say, capitalism sucks, we need a different conversation. They say, you are a very well-intentioned human being, but you don't understand how trade works. But when you go in and say, we need a return to green light subsidies because this is, then they go, oh, yeah, we can consider this, right? So you learn the language and the economic logics that are kind of sanctioned as valid and the legal techniques, and you manage to translate your demands into these formats, then you can get somewhere. But the flip side is that there are certain kinds of political demands that can't be translated. So you have kind of automatically, as you walk through the door, like what you're suggesting, you've internalized this particular worldview. And so this is kind of, this is documented as a problem. And so that kind of gets me to the question that was over here in the room around UNCTAD and other organizations. This is sort of the problem, right? Because even people from UNCTAD, I mean, UNCTAD is kind of a very interesting case in its own right. But what we have seen in this research on this new book I have coming out with Adrian Roberts in September, that's called A Feminist Political Economy of Trade, is that actually what happens now in Geneva is you have these types of informal meetings, WTO committees, things like that, where you have WTO officials, UNCTAD officials, Food and Agriculture Organization, International Labour Organization, and they sit around in the room and they go, okay, let's talk about the environment, or let's talk about gender, or let's talk about, within these conversations over time, the way in which the problems are understood and answers are being thought about are actually shaped in particular ways. So this is kind of not specifically on this paper, but in the book, what we found really interesting and also quite unnerving is we can actually pinpoint COVID-19 as the moment when UNCTAD in particular moved away from structural critique of trade development and the position within it, just abandoned it, and started promoting women empowerment through entrepreneurship and market-based approaches. So this is then also why part of what I kind of want to do with this research, and this kind of speaks to questions over here. No, of course we shouldn't be surprised that in the WTO this is how they see it. Like, there is a reason why, what you were saying, climate is measurable. That's great because trade is measurable. There is a reason why these communities find it quite natural that they can speak to each other. And if the WTO was insignificant, we could then say, that's a nice paper, but it's not relevant in the world. But the problem is, there are these kinds of contacts where officials from other international organizations go, and the WTO is the kind of authoritative forum for discussion and debate on trade, and they get drawn into these logics and conversations and start to adopt them. So, while maybe we're not going to see an environmental goods and services agreement anytime soon, these decision makers are going away and they've internalized a particular way of thinking about the problem. And so while most people will tell you the WTO is dead, forget about it, and they say it to me, and these are my colleagues, and they say, and that's a provocation. I say, I think you're missing a really big point here, which is that as a space and a place in global governance where taken for granted understandings of how the economy works and how we need to regulate it are developed, it is really influential. It is still, and then actually coming to talk about development in particular, again, what we saw in the gender study is the WTO Secretariat then uses aid for trade, uses trade and development committees as ways of teaching countries, teaching WTO members how to address the problem. So the WTO then says, country X, I'm gonna, part of aid for trade and kind of, WTO contributions to overseas development aid, which we're all cutting, is we're gonna give you a course on how to be a woman entrepreneur to solve the climate crisis through your low carbon footprint activity by connecting you to a transnational corporation. And so I actually think anyone who thinks this is, we shouldn't be surprised, I agree, but we should still really worry because it just carries a lot more weight, I think, than most people acknowledge because we've turned away from the WTO like the environmentalists. And I want us to look again. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, more questions. So we have a question at the back, former student Emily, and then a question over here as well.
Thanks so much. So I actually just wanted kind of a bit of a clarification because my read on kind of what's happening at the WTO at the moment and the position of developing countries is, so I'm South African, just for some context, and I have covered a little bit of trade before. The position seems to be very much anti-environmental intervention because if you look at things like CBAM, they're often so for people who don't know, CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Europe has basically said, we're trying to reduce our carbon footprint, so in order to kind of trade with us, you have to be on the same footing and treated the same way as our local producers. You also have to comply with all these environmental rules. But then developing countries say, that's not fair, that's a way of keeping us out of your markets. So kind of the narrative, especially with India and South Africa, you brought them up, that kind of pushback was at MC13, and that was to do with the moratorium on e-commerce. And that was the same kind of thing where they're looking at kind of trying to protect their own markets, but also to like keep annoying things. And I mean, I say annoying because that's like the wording they use. Like keep things like environmental regulation out of the way so that they can develop. And there are these LDC agendas and things like that. So I'm just wondering, like, because I'm just maybe not understanding where your critique, which I think is very necessary, but where exactly it sits within that broader debate, like free trade versus environment.
Go.
No, go ahead. Oh, okay. Well, my question's pretty simple and it's a bit not piggybacking.
Could you maybe put the microphone like more horizontal, like?
Okay, gotcha. My question's not relating to any of theirs or any like orgs or anything like that, but my question is, what do you think is the most overlooked actor or factor in current debates in on trade and environment? That's it.
Oh, I don't know. The most overlooked actor or factor in trade and environment debates.
I think he wants a dissertation topic.
I don't know if I can answer that off the cuff. I'm going to start with South Africa. That was also a difficult question, but a little bit easier than that one. Yeah, I actually did have on one of my slides, I had one of the quotes was the South African WTO ambassador who was exactly talking about CBAM and saying what we see now is this protectionist approach, and he uses this kind of language of saying, under the guise of environmental protection, you're closing off your market, so on and so forth. And so I completely understand the sentiment. I've actually spent a long time grappling with this position also in relation to the food trade debate, right? Whereas I think you kind of implied that it's similarly structured. It's like we have a lot of protectionism in the kind of advanced developed economies, and then the developmentalist perspective, we are told within the logic of the WTO, is to say we need free trade. And I just want to emphasize that in practical terms, I totally understand this, and I totally probably also support it, just given then the economic repercussions on people on the ground in the here and now. On a theoretical level, and as an academic, I have come to the view that the problem is that to think about trade policy choices as a binary between either free trade or protection is part of the thing that makes us not being able to solve it. Because we keep breaking down trade policy in terms of, here are the state interests, and then there is free trade or protectionism, so trade or no trade, and this is basically how you square this debate. But precisely the conversation around environment, like the conversation around food and the conversation around public health and all of these like big public policy topics, I think what we would actually need, and I acknowledge we're very far away from that, is a conversation around how do we want to organize trade on a global level to support these goals, right? Free trade or protection, I don't care. So this is the book that we have coming out, and again, this is a little bit different because this is all about the gender agenda and it's trying to come from a feminist perspective. But what are we saying at the end is, what would happen, even just as a thought experiment, if we said, let's think about arranging trade in a way that it would help support social reproduction for everybody in the world. So it's not anymore a conversation about, are you pro-trade or are you anti-trade? I actually think it's ridiculous to assume that humans wouldn't trade, because they always have. But I think to start thinking creatively in this moment where so much is so wrong in the world of trade and just the world overall, we need to think about, set different goals rather than growth or, I don't know, GDP or employment. Think about, for example, concepts like good conditions of social reproduction for everyone, and then start thinking backward and go, okay, so what would that mean for trade policy? And the funny thing that happens, because we experimented with it a little bit, some of this is like clearly really hypothetical at this moment in time, yeah? Some of these things you come up with, what if we thought about it like that? They're like politically so unfeasible, whatever. But actually, you can break it down to options we already have that are already on the table of trade policy debates, and it will point you in certain directions that are already possible. For example, around how do we interpret intellectual property rights and things like that. So I know it's kind of not a satisfying answer, but I think we need to move away from that free trade protectionism, because it ends us up in the place of the state interest, and that is then all tied in with the broader political economy of the moment that we need to get out of. And so actually that's just given me one way of answering your question. So the most overlooked factor is how do we start to think differently? So we were talking over lunch, Kathy, about the trade policies coming out of the US since the second Trump administration, and we spoke about how it's kind of striking that even in progressive circles, all that people can think of as responses to say, oh, we need the WTO back, we need to go back to free trade. But we've all been talking about, and some of us who are Polanyian might even think free trade got us to here in the first place. So how do we change the conversation? That's a really difficult one that's missing. But I think this is where we need to start thinking.
Okay. I did want to just ask something, piggying back on Emily's question, and it's driven by curiosity. That you kind of sort of talked about how forests and poor animals have been kind of kicked out of the discussion. And I wonder if part of the reason is high-income countries have found ways of making climate lucrative and developmental within their own economies, finding ways of sort of using climate as a way to do protectionism and to, upgrade. And I wonder, in the past, when animals were in the discussion and when forests were in the discussion, were there similar sort of business opportunities around this, or was it difficult to make business opportunities out of these other issues? And part of the reason they aren't on the agenda is because they don't really give high-income countries a kind of lever to, make money, change value chains in their interests. I'm being very cynical with my question, but...
I actually think the way in which the animals were being discussed was as a business opportunity in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about this famous, that you saw the turtles here on the slide, the famous shrimp turtle case, it all sort of started when the US introduced, I always teach this case in part because it has such a funny acronym in it. The US mandated that you could only import shrimp into the United States that were fished using TEDs. And TED, do you remember the TEDs?
No.
TEDs. So basically what the problem was that was identified by various environmental movements at the time, turtles were getting caught in nets of fish trawlers that were shrimp fishing, and turtles are an endangered species. And so there was then a way found around this, which was a particular type of net that basically had a trapdoor that allowed the turtles to get out, but the shrimp stayed in. It's too late in the day. And these trapdoors, the technical term for them, this is not a joke, they were called turtle excluder device, short TED. And so the whole shrimp turtle case arose because the US, in essence, this is a bit oversimplified, but in essence, it prevented countries import shrimp into the US that were fished with nets that didn't have TEDs, turtle excluder devices. And so then the case was brought actually by a group of developing countries who were saying this is an unjustifiable discrimination because we have other ways of preserving turtles. It didn't have to be a TED, right? And so while it was on the one hand really a case that was about kind of animals and life forms that were perishing and all that sort of stuff. At the end of the day, when it was on the table of the court, if you want to put it like that, in Geneva, it was about the commercial opportunities that were being allowed or denied by particular forms of regulation around how you then commercialize this into a food product, basically, right? So it is a bit like you asked me the question, would the conversation be different if we talked about animals? That's not a sufficient criterion. It wasn't then, yeah.
Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, one last chance? No? Oh, Rob has a question right here in the white shirt.
Thank you so much for coming and talking tonight. I'm still trying to put my question together, so I apologize if it's a bit vague, and it speaks to the fact that where do we go from here? There was this event earlier this week that was talking about capitalist value change and the extractive nature of those. And there's an idea there of sort of profit can't be the end motive. So what do you put in place of that? And sort of a similar question here of the idea of just more and more trade doesn't seem to be the solution, but that's the framework. So what is the alternative framework where theoretically, as you said, you still have trade because that's a normal human activity, but what do you put as the alternative goal rather than simply more trade?
So I mean, there is lots of, so the first thing actually I want to say on the where do we go from here, I was very serious when I said in my lecture, I don't want to be the one telling you, because I don't believe But also, James is laughing, but it's also just a political choice. It has to come out of a democratic conversation. There can't be one person that sits at the top and says, okay, everyone, here's where we gotta go, right? So in a way, for me, the answer is, and something that I kind of hope to support with my scholarly work, is we need to get people interested in these things, knowing about these things, and getting politically active in these things, right? In the first instance. So then the question isn't where do I say we go from here, but the question then is, if I say from here we all need to go to a protest, why do I go and what do I have in mind to start the conversation with everyone else around that? And so for me, this is the point that I was making about conditions of social reproduction, which is a term that comes from feminist political economy, and it's very theoretical, but let me explain. So feminists have talked about how one of the ways in which the economy is gendered is even what we consider to be economic activity, right? And they make a distinction between the productive economy, which is all that stuff I had on my slide, basically with the fog coming, like industry, different services, the kind of jobs that pay money. This is generally what we think of as the economy. And feminists have argued for a very long time, this is not the only place where people work, right? Yeah, people go to work in companies and maybe state bureaucracies, etc., but also people work in the household all day long. There's all kinds of labor that is being provided there, that's caretaking work, that's household chores. And one of the ways in which both the economy and economic theory have been gendered for centuries is to not consider that part of it. This is just not what we're talking about. When we're talking about trade and the economy, we're talking about people going to work in a factory. But what we're writing about here is the problem is trade relations also affect all these other kinds of work that are not paid, that are not valued, that are not even considered to be part of where the economy sits. And so from our perspective, when we say trade and social reproduction should be the goal, is to actually look at the totality of all the work that basically leads to the reproduction of life. Not just how do we make stuff, but how do we reproduce life on the planet? And then start thinking about what kinds of trade do we need to make that better for everyone. And where we stand right now, the easiest point to start is what do we not need, right? And you could already point to lots of different things, and different kinds of movements have pointed to that. That's already there in the trade routes, that's really not helpful, and that we could just start stripping out. Investment protection is a huge one. Intellectual property protection has probably gone way too far. Like, there's lots of different things that we could already start saying, okay, this is really geared towards a very particular private interest. So let's start stripping away at that and then move through the conversation. But kind of let's not be limited in our thinking about the economy by the idea that it has to necessarily be about standard economic indicators, because it's way bigger than that.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess Emily wanted to add a question. Is that okay? Yeah.
When are the drinks?
They're at 6 o'clock.
I have time.
Okay. So one final question, and then we will close and we'll go for drinks at the pub. And it is such a lovely day today that we can probably stand happily outside.
I definitely don't want to hijack this, and this can be answered at the pub. I just wanted, because I find it very interesting, I wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind expanding a bit more on, you referred to, for example, a lot of the kind of aid for trade development programs that target women, like talking about kind of social reproductive trade, etc. You say that it's not necessarily, good. It's like very maybe capitalist centric kind of, but then in terms of like assisting women based on the environment as it exists with like technical assistance and And also my background is aid for trade in Africa. So it's like kind of thinking about, you did say the easiest place to start is what not to do. So, but I'm going to be annoying and ask, well, what would maybe a better alternative be in these situations? Because aid for trade, in a lot of cases, does, it makes a huge difference on how well women, especially women in the informal sector, can navigate technical trade requirements and then make, a living for their families. So it's kind of just like, what is the problematic point?
Yeah, I get it, Yeah, so I mean, absolutely, this is the huge political dilemma, right? Like, as you say, these women entrepreneurship initiatives, or we're seeing it in the green trade, indigenous business leaders get to go to WTO meetings. Isn't it also empowering and great? And I think it makes a difference for the person, right? That is kind of being the beneficiary of this. But that's precisely, in a way, the problem, because it's a way of thinking about the world that is really focused on the individual. And that assumes that if we just help enough individuals, the world will come back into balance or something like that. And I'm just really skeptical about that, because actually, what I'm seeing is that a lot of the structural inequalities that have marginalized, for example, in these informal economic actors in the first place, they're being reproduced, or at least they're not being challenged or not being undermined, right? So I don't want to be the person that sits here and says, stop supporting women entrepreneurs through aid for trade. But at the same time, I don't understand why we can't do both. Why can't we do that and continue to have the structural conversation, right? And this is precisely what this book is about, is that actually it wasn't possible. UNCTAD, ECLAC in Latin America, they came into this gender conversation from day one with a really strong structuralist critique, saying it's nice to help entrepreneurs, but we also have these huge structural inequalities in the global economy, and they're being reproduced through the trading system, so we also have to have these conversations. And over time, you can just see, over a 4 or 5 year period, these people are like kind of just exited from the conversation, or they change their own mind. So again, the power of the socialization, and they say, actually, let's do women empowerment. And so that's my frustration. I don't want to take away from that. As I say, I don't want to say indigenous business leader, don't go to the WTO. But I want to say that can't be the only thing that we do. We have to do both at the same time, at a minimum.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's give her a final round of applause. I do have some good news that one of our cancelled earlier talks by Patricia Owens is actually related. It's about feminist foreign policy, A World Without Men, very provocative title, has been rescheduled for May 15th in the summer term. So please put that on your calendars and we will be sharing more information. But finally, please join us at the pub for more drinks, and you can come and talk to our speaker and discuss it there. Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you have wonderful weekends, and happy Eid to everybody.
And thanks for the great questions as well.